In 2001, the Nintendo Game Boy Color was dominating the handheld market. Sleek and powerful with a colored screen, the Game Boy Color was the handheld system of choice at the time. With over 1,500 games available to play, there was always something new to experience. However, the traditional Game Boy format was beginning to show its age and was due for an upgrade. After 12 long years in the market, the Game Boy line of handhelds would come to an end. During this time, Nintendo was hard at work, designing and developing what would be soon released as the Game Boy Advance. Released in March of 2001, the Game Boy Advance was the true successor to the original Game Boy line of handhelds. By rearranging the controls to both sides of the display and adding L and R shoulder buttons as additional inputs, the Game Boy Advance felt like a radically different system than the previous Game Boy handhelds released prior. With a larger, high-resolution screen, a faster CPU, more RAM, longer battery life, and backwards compatibility with previous Game Boy and Game Boy Color games, the Game Boy Advance was an easy upgrade decision, if your wallet had the funds to support it. All was not sunshine and roses, however, with the Game Boy Advance. While it was newer and faster, with a large, high-resolution display and even more control options, there was still one large issue that was hard to overlook, and even more problematic, hard to see in the dark. And that was the screen. Nintendo's Game Boy Advance, like its predecessors of past, came with neither a front-lit nor backlit screen. No, this was your standard reflective TFT screen, which relied on external light support to reflect off the rear of the display, back out the front, in order for your eyes to see the screen. It was inconvenient, frustrating, and downright anger-inducing when your light would quit working in the middle of a critical battle with a boss, a race, or trying to catch that hard-to-get Pokemon. So why are we talking about the Game Boy Advance today, roughly 16 years after the discontinuation of the sale of the Game Boy Advance? Well, because despite its flaws with the screen, the feel and form factor of the Game Boy Advance made it one of the most comfortable, most fun to use handhelds that Nintendo has ever released. Combined with its backwards compatibility of the Game Boy and Game Boy Color line of games, the Game Boy Advance continues to have a large and passionate following for retro game fans. And those fans have done new and incredible things to breathe life back into this older console. One of the most popular mods to the Game Boy Advance is that of replacing the screen with a better, backlit display. To achieve this, there are two popular modification methods commonly used. The first is with an AGS-101 screen pulled from a Game Boy Advance SP, or the newer method is to use a custom IPS display. Which now brings us to the point of this video. You can see here that we have two backlit Game Boy Advance systems. The first is running the traditional AGS-101 screen. The second is using the newer IPS V2 display. Both have their benefits, but which solution is best for your situation? Follow along as we compare and contrast these two separate displays to help you make the decision on which way you want to go with your Game Boy Advance. To begin with, let's take a look at the specs for each type of screen. The AGS-101 screen has a diagonal size of 2.9 inches with a 240 by 160 pixel display. The IPS screen has a diagonal of 3.19 inches with a 480 by 360 pixel display. It has a max brightness of 350 nits and a max power consumption of 274 milliwatts. Max brightness and power draw are unknown for the AGS-101 screen, but my installation is using a newer version of the ribbon cable with an additional wire to supply better voltage for a brighter display. Installation of both screens is very similar in complexity. Both installations require some basic trimming to the shell in order to fit the differently sized display, and some careful folding of the ribbon cables in order to properly fit everything together. The AGS-101 screen mod does require a bit more careful matching, however, as there are different types of screens you may encounter. Careful matching of the screen to the ribbon type that matches the connector on your motherboard needs to be verified in order to ensure a successful build. The IPS screen, on the other hand, is significantly simpler as there's only one type of display and one ribbon cable that can be adapted for both pin counts on the motherboard. The next thing we want to take a look at is battery life. How do these two screens compare against each other, as well as the factory screen in terms of battery life? In all of these tests, the systems were supplied with two 2400 mAh rechargeable batteries. I ran two different tests to check this out. In the first test, the IPS screen ran for 8 hours and 24 minutes, while the AGS-101 screen ran for 17 hours and 2 minutes. Even more than that, the stock screen ran for a whopping 34 hours and 57 minutes, blowing away the other two screens in battery life. These results surprised me a little bit as I noticed the Dragon Ball Z game that was running on the stock display appeared to draw less battery than the introduction sequence of the Pokemon games did. So I reran the test with just an IPS screen and the stock screen again, both running the Pokemon games. This time I got 9 hours and 19 minutes on the IPS screen, and still 29 hours and 54 minutes on the stock screen. As you can see, both backlight screens drastically reduce the battery life when compared with the stock display. It is interesting to note that in my case, the AGS-101 screen configuration, which used the additional wire to supply additional voltage to the display, appeared to significantly drain the battery more than the stock display. Colin from This Does Not Compute performed a similar test a while back, and in his case he actually got a longer battery life from his AGS-101 screen when compared to the stock screen. But that came at a cost of a greatly reduced display brightness compared to mine. Next up we have screen performance. Now this is a bit of an interesting comparison as my setup is actually using the newer V2 version of the ribbon cable to attach the IPS display to the Game Boy Advance. If you have an older version, however, you may experience some screen tearing due to some frame buffering issues on the ribbon cable that are not present in the V2 configuration. Let's start with a brightness comparison of the display in outdoor situations. You can see here that both screens struggle to be able to overcome direct sunlight outdoors. But if I boost the brightness on my camera a bit, you can see that the IPS screen is actually able to be viewed a little bit easier in outdoor light. If we move both of the Game Boy Advances to indirect lighting outdoors, it's still a similar story. You can view the IPS screen much better in comparison to the AGS-101 screen. Moving indoors, however, we can see that both screens are much easier to see, and the brightness differences between the two types of screens is much less apparent. Another thing that we want to take a look at are viewing angles. Now obviously this is not a very important issue, as you're not usually looking at the Game Boy Advance from such a strong angle, but it's worth comparing anyway just to show you the differences. You can see that the IPS screen has pretty impressive viewing angles, both horizontally as well as vertically. Moving over to the AGS-101 screen, however, and it's an entirely different story. The screen quickly washes out in color with significantly worse viewing angles from all directions. Next, let's take a look at that additional resolution provided by the IPS screen. The IPS screen is capable of effectively pixel doubling. That is, drawing each graphic pixel onto a 2x2 grid of pixels on the display. This doesn't actually increase the effective resolution of the output signal, but it does help to smooth out the appearance of the display as well as helping to reduce the screen door effect on the display. One thing that's worth pointing out, however, is the screen smearing differences between both screens. If I slow the video down, you can see significant smearing or ghosting of the image as I move up and down on the AGS-101 screen. Compare that to the IPS screen, which is buttery smooth in slow motion. I'm not sure if this is due to pixel doubling due to the much smaller pixel size or a faster response time of the pixels, but the difference is quite striking. So as you can see, both options provide a substantially better experience when compared to the stock Game Boy Advance screen. With either option, you will certainly be happy with the end results. However, that being said, there are some clear differences between the two. Number 1, the IPS screen has a substantially lower battery life compared to the AGS-101 screen by about 30%. Number 2, the AGS-101 screen is getting significantly harder to find and the price continues to increase. Number 3, the AGS-101 screen is slightly harder to install as it requires careful verification and matching of the screen to the adapter ribbon cable to the motherboard. Number 4. Color is much richer on the IPS screen with significantly better viewing angles and much less image smearing. Number 5. The IPS screen has a much smoother pixel display as well due to its high resolution and smaller pixels, but this could be a pro or a con depending on your preference. So in summary, which one is the best one to go with? Well, unfortunately it depends. I know, that's always the worst answer to give, but in this case it's true. It does depend heavily on what you have available and what your situation is like. Do you have a broken AGS-101 system but with a good screen? Then I'd definitely pick that over the IPS screen. For me, however, if I had a system that I was looking to do backlight screen mod to and I didn't have anything already available to me, I would choose the IPS screen. So what would you choose? Thank you so much for watching. I wanted to try something a little bit different for this video, so I went with a radically different format. This took so much longer than any of my previous videos to shoot and edit and post. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope it was worth the additional effort for this video. I've even done some equipment upgrading since the last video and have bumped the quality of this video up to 4K. If you enjoyed it and you're not a subscriber, please consider subscribing to the channel. Also, if you have any recommendations for future content, please let me know. I would love to hear them. And as always, thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Take care. Bye-bye.